Hello, this is Vic Hermanson. This is Season 2, Episode 13 of the Trailer Trash Terrors podcast. I want to warn anybody listening that there is no joy in this episode at all. Any joy that does happen to find its way in is quickly killed by the evil we are discussing. As I quote others, you will hear profanity. You will hear sexist slurs. You'll hear racial slurs. You'll hear many of the things that people today so rightfully try to avoid. But the story simply cannot be told without including those things. At least it can't be told in a way that feels, to me, like it's respecting what happened to the innocent victims of the story. This is the only trigger warning I've ever given. There is no joy in this show. And there's no way to put joy there while remaining factually and emotionally true to the events we're talking about. Anyway, welcome to Trailer Trash Terrors. Hang on. I consider this one to be a wild ride.
Greetings, temporal humans. This is Boudreaux, the humor-appropriate cybernetic ghost from the future. I asked Vic Hermanson to change the music for this episode, as I am still processing the strong emotions, even if they are virtual emotions. This week's content has caused my ghostly circuits to generate. This week, and in the next 2 weeks, Vic Hermanson will be discussing perfect possession, or at least his experiences, in several inpatient hospital settings, that he feels to be, after deep reflection, instances of perfect or near-perfect demonic possession. This episode is titled, I Could Not Carry Buddy Safely Through the Valley of Chaos.
Well, I must admit, it's good to hear the swamp sounds again. I could not carry Buddy safely through the Valley of Chaos. That is an absolutely true statement. I couldn't. It's something that I haven't necessarily regretted over the years. It's just something that I wish I had been able to do. Of course, doing so would have required powers far beyond my own. Tonight we're going to talk about perfect possession, and I'm going to take my time in doing so. I first read Malachi Martin's Hostage to the Devil probably 30 years ago, and then immediately went back and read it again, and have talked about it with everyone I could find who was willing to do so since then. In that book, he talks about perfect possession. Let me let him talk about it in his own words.
Really, the perfectly possessed, we call them the perfectly possessed, are those that are completely at peace. And I've known several of the perfectly possessed, and I avoid them like the pest. And you know them only by almost accidental means. Sometimes they're perfectly normal, by the way, and they've got great business property. They're married, they have children and wives, and they put down responsible jobs. There's nothing wrong there. Now and again, just now and again, it's as it were, a veil is drawn aside, and you see somebody you don't know at all. You just don't know this person, this man, this woman. And there's a completely alien look, a completely alien attitude, and they breathe alienation.
That clip was Malachi Martin speaking to Art Bell on the old Coast to Coast AM radio show. If you don't know who Malachi Martin is, it's definitely worth your time to spend an hour, or whatever time it takes, finding out about him. You can do so on YouTube easily. He was a Jesuit priest. He was Irish. He was an advisor and an assistant to several popes. He was a scholar in multiple languages, had multiple PhDs, perhaps was a bishop, was an exorcist, and later in his career he was, by his own request, laicized, moved to the United States, mostly in New York, and wrote a number of very important books, including what I believe is most notable, Hostage to the Devil. He put forth the assertion that there are people walking in the world who are possessed and are fully comfortable with being possessed. They have fully allied their souls with evil, with forces that work against God, whether that be a demon, Satan, whatever you want to name it. They are souls that are allied to the evil part of the universe.
That's right. And they have passed through the usual Satanist rituals too. The three Satanist rituals: the power of inflicting pain, the power of hating, and the power of burning fire. Fire is part of the Satanist and the Luciferian development. And they've passed through all those with flying colors.
Father Martin gave a set of characteristics that one could look for in trying to determine who was and who was not perfectly possessed. I'll revisit those. But for now, I want to tell you the story of Buddy, because this is where I first became aware that such people exist everywhere. This is where I first became aware that occasionally, in the hospital, I would run into things that could not be treated physically, could not be treated with medication, could not be treated with physical therapy, could not be treated with IVs. In fact, they couldn't be treated at all. So here is the story of Buddy. I'll do my best to tell you about an innocent little boy who was a helpless but astoundingly brave pawn in an insidious and very evil game. During the 12 years or so that I practiced nursing full-time, I came across 15 cases of patients and patients' families that displayed behavior that eventually seemed to me to be outside the realm of normal. Tonight I'm going to talk about the first one. It's a story about a little boy named Buddy. Buddy was 3 years old. He was the perfect little boy for TV commercials, magazine ads, big brown eyes, beautiful thick blonde hair, chubby cheeks, just a little boy. The day I first met him, he was in the pediatric unit at a small Houston hospital. Sometimes back then, they would create a pediatric unit out of an adult unit, just by adding some doors and painting some Mickey Mouse characters on the walls. Suddenly you had a pediatric unit. Usually, they didn't even have their own nurse station. So I walked into the room that day, and I saw Buddy. I had read about him in his chart. He was in Buck's traction. Buck's traction means that your legs are suspended in the air by skin adhesive. In his case, he was going to be in Buck's traction for 3 months because he had bilateral fractured femurs. The question of how those fractured femurs came about was quite central to Buddy's case and what we're talking about today. The first time I walked into that hospital room, Buddy was alone. It was a private room. There was no mother, no brother, no father, just Buddy, there in the bed. As soon as he heard the door make a sound, he reached down and pulled his hospital gown up over his head, so as to not see who was coming in. And I heard from under the hospital gown, "Can't see me." But he couldn't really say "sees" very well. It was really something closer to "tan't see me." Just the fact that Buddy displayed that particular behavior, that he pulled his gown up and said teasingly, "Can't see me," told me much of what I needed to know. A, Buddy was alert and awake. B, he wasn't in any immediate distress. C, he was fully capable of communicating at least some of his thoughts and needs. Knowing those three things meant that I could take my time in assessing him and learning who this little boy was. So I walked around the room for a few seconds and surveyed his fairly complicated traction apparatus. It all seemed to be in good order right at the time, so I played along. And I said, "Who's this boy I can't see? I can't see any boy at all. I heard there was a boy in here, but I can't see him." Then I heard a giggle from under his gown, and he pulled his gown down real fast and said, "Now you can see me." So far, everything with Buddy was completely normal. This was a delightful, smart, funny, joking little kid. Then he pulled his gown up again. He took his right hand and he pointed to his chest real hard. And he said, "You got one D's too?" What he was pointing at was a large port wine birthmark on the right side of his chest, following roughly the contour of his ribs. Sometimes these birthmarks can become very rough and kind of scaly. This one was very smooth, and I think Buddy was kind of proud of it. When he first saw me, he pointed at my pocket and my neck and said, "What them are? What them are?" I looked down, and he was pointing to my stethoscope, which I always carried around my neck, and a pair of utility scissors that I had in my breast pocket right at that time. So I took the stethoscope from around my neck, showed it to him, and said, "These are my special ears. Do you want to hear?" It's always an easy way to get a kid to be happy by letting him listen to his own heart. So I gently put the silicone tips of the stethoscope in Buddy's ears and put the bell on his chest. And he could suddenly hear his heart. And you could see his eyes light up. And he would beat his little hand on the bed. Bum, 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 bum. And at that point, I think I had pretty much earned Buddy's trust. So I asked him about himself. "Who are you?" "I'm Buddy." He knew his name. I said, "What do you like?" He said, "I like turtles." Yeah, I know. It's an internet meme, but it is what he said. He said, "I have a turtle song." "Okay, what is your turtle song?" He said, "There's a turtle in the grass and he walks real slow." And then he said, "You sing." And I said, "I don't know the words." He said, "Just make some words." And he said, "There's a turtle in the grass and he's got purple eyes." Well, this went on for a while, and I was really enjoying myself. It's fun to take care of kids, especially if they are going to recover. Kids are brave. Finally, I took his vital signs, made sure that he was not febrile at the time, made sure that his diaper was clean, as he was not going to be getting up out of that bed. He had, through his injury, regressed a bit, and, at least for a while, went back to using a diaper. Then I asked the question that I must ask. I said, "Buddy, what happened to your legs?" Instantly, the happy little boy went away, and a frightened, shivering little boy lay there in front of me, with shadows and ghosts in his eyes. He looked at me and said, "Can't tell you." I said, "Okay, buddy, can you give me a clue about what happened to your legs?" He said, "Monster Man. Monster Man." And then he said, with all the anger a 3-year-old could muster, and all the force a perfectly innocent soul can put forth, "Monster Man hurt my legs." Listen to that one more time. The Monster Man hurt my legs. After he said those words, he looked at me like he expected me to laugh, or to get angry, or to just leave. The truth is, I had no earthly idea what to say. So I said, "Buddy, there are no monster men here, and we're going to get your legs better. You can't really lower your head when you're flat on your back." But he moved his chin closer to his chest and said, "Monster Man with mommy." Okay, it's time for an aside. Believe me, nothing would make me happier than to be able to stop right at this point and say, "Oh, this is all just fiction." But it's not. And that is the reason I'm telling it the way I am. Because it's just almost too painful for me to sit down and write it out, word for word, event for event, all at one time. I need to tackle it a paragraph at a time, one thought at a time, one personal experience at a time. Otherwise, it's overwhelming. So like I said, this story is going to take a while. Has it occurred to you yet that a 3-year-old boy with bilateral broken femurs should never be in a room by himself? That child should never be left alone. That's what you'll find when you are walking around the edges of the world of the perfectly possessed. Reality changes. Protocols are overlooked. People forget rules. It's like reality is behind a thick pane of glass. Surely you've seen a movie where somebody is desperately trying to scream for help to someone who's just right through a pane of glass, and they can't hear them at all. That's kind of how it feels. It feels like, I know what reality is. This doesn't feel that way, but I don't know how to get through that pane of glass. At about that time, I found out why Buddy was in that room alone. Melissa came through the door. Melissa was Buddy's aunt. I believe she was 16, maybe 17. She was tiny, she was intense, blue eyes, blonde hair, and absolutely out of control. The reason she was not in the room was because she had gone down to the parking lot to smoke what we'll have to call weed these days. Yeah, leave your broken femur nephew in bed, go down to the parking lot, hide behind a bush, and smoke some weed. When she saw me, the first thing she said was, "Who the hell are you?" I explained I was Buddy's nurse. She backed off a wee bit. Then she saw the hemostats in my pocket. She came over, put her hand in my pocket, took those hemostats, and said, "Wow, these would just be fantastic for smoking roaches. Can I have them, please?" I explained to her that I needed them for my work, and then she started snuggling up next to me, saying, "Oh, come on, you can give them to me." Finally, I realized I'm not giving this girl my hemostats, so I just gently removed them from her hand, put them back in my pocket, and I said, "Listen, I've got to go check Buddy's medication. Are you going to stay here with him while I'm gone?" She scowled and said, "Yeah, I'll stay here." Melissa was one of 2 family members around whom Buddy seemed happy and comfortable. She was his aunt, and she was still more or less a kid herself, so Buddy seemed to warm up to her. He also seemed okay around his grandmother, but she rarely came. She never came by herself, and when she did come, it was a war between the grandmother, the mother, and her boyfriend. There was a father. The boyfriend was not Buddy's father. There was a father who showed up once or twice. Buddy seemed to not fear this man, but he also seemed to be fairly distant from him. So just give me a moment, and then we'll go through the cast of characters. We'll talk about who's who in the world of Buddy. Let's start with Buddy's grandmother. She was late 50s, early 60s, a very standard Texas country woman, 5'8", big hair, big personality, big smile. Probably not a great deal of education, but very, very smart and savvy. She loved Buddy. She would come when she could, but she was forbidden to be there unless the mother and boyfriend were also there. She seemed confused and sad much of the time, as if she were wondering inside, how did my family get the way it is? Buddy's father was a short, round man who wore a faded suit, crumpled shirt, and an old tie. He had a serious face most of the time, but when he saw Buddy, he became happy and strong and seemed to grow. He had hands that didn't match his body or his face. They were long, dexterous hands, like those of a pianist. And I can remember him holding Buddy's hand and singing the Turtle Song with him. But as I say, I only saw him a few times. Take just a few seconds and listen to a clip from this 1952 Canadian medical film. It's called Folie à deux.
We are going to see 2 patients, mother and daughter, who are suffering from folie à deux, or induced insanity, one of the less common forms of mental disease. This psychosis develops first in one person and is then communicated to one or more persons who have a close emotional attachment to the one originally affected. It is usually seen in couples who live a rather secluded life, dependent on each other. For instance, parent and child, husband and wife, or 2 spinster sisters.
The reason I played that clip is because it's virtually impossible to think of Buddy's mother and Buddy's mother's boyfriend as 2 separate people. They were always together. It seemed almost painful to them to not be touching each other. Buddy's mother was pretty. She was 30, 32, maybe 5'7", 5'8". She was slender. She was athletically built. She was strong. And she had the deep blonde strawberry hair that Buddy had, as well as his big brown eyes. The boyfriend was the polar opposite of Buddy's father. He was perhaps 6'5". He was built like a bodybuilder. He wore cowboy clothes, boots, hats, jeans. He chewed tobacco. He was almost a caricature of the rugged Texas cowboy. They each moved with incredible grace and had faces that were absolutely devoid of lines, of wrinkles, even of laugh lines. As Dickens would say, "Now that I have told you this, you must remember it, for it is important to all that happens henceforth." In non-Dickens terms, that means remember that their faces were completely smooth.
Vic Hermansen. I sense, because of your vocal inflections, body posture, and rapidly changing facial expressions, that you are finding it difficult to relate this story to the audience. Is this true? Is it possible for me to be of any assistance? I have been told that I have tremendous narrative skill.
Boudreaux is absolutely right. I'm having a great deal of trouble in telling this story. First, I'm going back many years. I'm discussing something that was terrifying and confusing back then. And I'm trying to rebuild it in a way that is relatable to the audience. So yeah, this is a very, very hard story to tell. So I'm going to back up and break it down into smaller pieces. First off, this is my premise. Buddy's mother and Buddy's mother's boyfriend were both perfectly possessed. They shared demonic possession. This was not forced demonic possession. This was welcome demonic possession. I used the term earlier from the psychiatrist, folie à deux. Man, I just can't say those things. But I'm taking it even a step further. I believe that these two people formed a certain pact in order to gain power in the world, in order to feel safer, in order to feel stronger. I don't know why. I'm not driven by that kind of motivation. Not only did they form this pact in my mind, but Buddy was, in the end, looked at by them as being a sacrificial object. Now, that's a horrible accusation to make toward anyone, especially a child's mother. But that's what I saw. That's what I believe the reality was. I also like the way the psychiatric community coined that French phrase to describe this particular type of mental illness. It encapsulates it. It makes it easier to think of it as an individual thing. So I'm going to continue to use that, but I've made up some new phrases. First, they started with madness for two, which in French is something like folie à deux. I am horrible at pronouncing French, so let's let Google Translate, pronounce madness for two correctly.
Folie à deux. Folie à deux. Folie à deux.
To that, I'm going to add a new concept that I'm starting out calling possession for two. I've never heard this discussed anywhere else, but this is what I saw. Let's hear the French.
Possession pour deux. Possession pour deux. Possession pour deux.
As I believe Buddy's mother and her boyfriend were perfectly happy being in the state of possession, here's the French for perfect possession for two.
Possession parfaite pour deux. Possession parfaite pour deux. Possession parfaite pour deux.
Finally, and Malachi Martin would certainly say that I'm stepping out of my realm of expertise, I think the term I would prefer to use in what I saw with Buddy's mother and Buddy's mother's boyfriend is perfect shared possession. Let's hear the French.
Parfaite possession partagée. Parfaite possession partagée. Parfaite possession partagée.
Parfaite possession partagée. That is probably a horrible mangling of the French. Why am I spending the time talking about these French translations? Well, I'm trying to quantify in my mind exactly what I saw. And I want to get across the point that I'm not joking. I want to get across the point that what I'm discussing here was deadly serious. It was a set of events that involved an entire family. It was a set of events that involved two souls that had already willingly made a pact with something evil to bring evil to the world. It was a story of at least two people, the aunt and the grandmother, who could kind of see what was happening, but couldn't do a damn thing about it. And finally, it's the story of Buddy, a completely innocent soul that I have no idea what finally happened to. But let me tell you what happened to him while he was in the hospital. Once again, trigger warning. If you don't want to hear this, turn it off, because there's no joy in what I'm about to tell you. None at all.
Vic Hermanson, why don't you discuss a few of the day-to-day experiences you had in dealing with Buddy and his family?
That's a very good idea. I'm going to try to do this extemporaneously, and if I make small mistakes, I'm just going to leave them in. I only cared for Buddy for a total of about 2 weeks. And I guess I was working about 10 days of those 2 weeks. The first time, as I said, that I saw Buddy, he was alone, and then I met his aunt. Well, just at that point, I realized that something wasn't quite right. So I designed my work schedule such that I could spend as much time as possible in Buddy's room. I was lucky in that time that my other patients really weren't that demanding. It was late that evening that I first met Buddy's mother and her boyfriend. As I said, I never saw them separately. Essentially, they were always touching. They came into Buddy's room while I was doing what we called neurovascular checks, essentially making sure that the blood flow to his feet, his toes, was fine, making sure that no nerves had been compressed with the tight bandages that held his legs in the air. The first thing that Buddy's mother said to me was the same thing as the first thing that Buddy's aunt said to me. "Who the hell are you?" And it was said with an extreme venom. Now let me talk about the voices of the perfectly possessed. First off, I was Buddy's nurse. I was supposed to be taking care of him. It was my job to be there, making sure that his toes and his feet and his butt and his back and all those places that were being compressed were in good shape. I needed to move him around enough to make sure that he wasn't, even at 3 years old, going to get bed sores. At that time, we had access to lambskins, lamb's wool, little tiny rugs that you could use to shield or cushion some part of the body, and I had gotten one of those. So I was kind of used to the "who the hell are you" question, and I turned around and said, "Hi, I'm Victor. I'm Buddy's nurse tonight. Probably would be Buddy's nurse for a while, since that's how we do things around here." And you could tell that she was angry that I was his nurse. I kind of expected her to go to the nursing station, find the charge nurse for the floor, and say they wanted somebody else, which probably would have been granted. But she didn't. She started asking me questions. She'd ask me questions like, "Well, what do you think about Buddy's injuries? Do you think Buddy will be able to walk again? Do you think Buddy will be psychologically damaged?" Asking me questions that were not unusual, questions that were not bad, but the tone of voice that she used was more taunting than the tone of voice that one would use to try to get information. Of all of the people that I met in the hospital, who I believe had agreed to a state of possession with whatever entity you want to say that was, I'm going to say a demon, they all had one specific characteristic that I probably found more frightening than anything else. When they spoke, there was an underlying, painful harmonic to their voice. It was like hearing 2 or 3 or 4 voices at one time, coming at you powerfully from slightly different directions, with slightly different timings. And it was a tone that seemed to be designed to bring about stress and pain. I winced. I remember just kind of closing my eyes and stepping back a little bit. When I opened my eyes, they were both smiling. The smile was that of a predator. The smile was not that of a parent wanting the best for their child. Experience 2. In those days, the standard work shift for a nurse was 8 hours, 7 to 3, 3 to 11, 11 to 7. Now, most hospitals use a 12-hour shift, generally 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. I like to work 3 to 11. I like to sleep late in the morning, and I kind of liked the fact that I could stay up and talk to people after work. But twice a shift, I would go into Buddy's room and do the full assessment, and clean him up, and make sure that there were no wrinkles or anything in his bed that was going to cause him a problem. I don't mean to dwell on that, but if you're going to be in the same position for 3 months, someone's going to have to make sure that your skin doesn't break down. Well, I was then, and am now, a Christian. I'm Catholic. And it was not uncommon for me to, while I was taking vital signs, giving a bath, to say a simple prayer for the patient I was taking care of. The prayer was just something like, Heavenly Father, I ask that you guide my hands and my heart in caring for this patient. I ask that you send your healing to him or her. And that was about it. It was just a prayer that I used in dealing with patients. Always silent, always in my own mind, in my own heart. Well, I did the same thing for Buddy. And as soon as I started to say that prayer, there was a scream, a screech. It was Buddy's mother. I'm not going to scream into the microphone, but it was, "Stop that, goddammit! God has no place here!" I know I had not moved my lips. I know that I made no sounds. I know that I didn't let anybody know what I was doing. This was just a standard part of my dealing with everyone. Today, I still do this. If I run into somebody that I think needs help, that seems to me to be having a problem, I will say a short, very simple prayer. Heavenly Father, please help this person. That's all. But doing that in that room somehow alerted Buddy's mother that I was saying that prayer. She knew this. And that prayer to her was more horrifying than anything else that seemed to be happening in those 2 weeks. I looked at her and I said, "Stop what?" And she said, "You know what you were doing." She was very, very angry. And I said, "Ma'am, I'm just taking care of Buddy. I'm just doing his vital signs and cleaning him up." And once again, at this point, I figured that she would request somebody else to take care of Buddy. I would have even understood because she seemed to really, really dislike me. It's important that a family like and trust the people taking care of their children. But she didn't. This is another thing about the perfectly possessed, at least in the hospital environment. The standard protocols, the standard things that are supposed to happen, the standard rules that bring order to the workday seem to fall by the wayside. People seem to forget the proper things to do. For some reason, in many of these instances, I was the only person who recognized that normal protocols were being broached. Now, I was doing nothing outside of the ordinary, and everybody was there in the room. Even then, I was fairly careful if I was dealing with a child to make sure that the parents, somebody responsible, another nurse, was there simply because I wanted to avoid any kind of legal entanglement. But somehow, Buddy's mother knew that I was saying a simple silent prayer, and she hated that fact. Now, there are probably people in the audience who are going to say, well, you have no right at all to be praying for your patients. Well, you deal with your patients the way you want to, and I'll deal with them the way I want to. I wanted my patients to be healed. I saw no problem in simply and quickly praying for them. I've had many patients hold my hand and say, will you pray with me? Of course I'll pray with you. Even if I were atheist, the answer would be, well, yes, ma'am, of course I'll pray with you. Because it would be harmless to me, and it might be beneficial to the patient. Experience 3. The police. A human femur is a very strong thing. Very, very difficult to break. A huge amount of force needs to be brought to bear to break a femur mid-shaft. A 3-year-old boy's femur is not only strong, but it is flexible and resilient. It will not break immediately. It'll bend. You'll get a hairline fracture. You'll get a green stick fracture. But that clean break, that takes a lot of energy to get done. So the question, of course, was, how did Buddy's legs get broken? The official story from the mother was that Buddy had fallen off the porch of their home. They lived in what was called the Heights, and many of these older homes had crawl spaces. And so there were porches, there were stairs that went up 3, sometimes 4 feet. I have no idea how far Buddy fell, if he did indeed fall, but it couldn't have been more than about 3 feet. A 3-foot fall for a child Buddy's age and size would cause some bruising, some scraping, maybe a bent finger, maybe a bloody lip. But there is almost no way that it could cause bilateral broken femurs. The police knew this too, and so they were investigating. There were no witnesses, at least none that would come forward. And even though Buddy's x-rays showed a number of healed past fractures, he was well fed. He was apparently bright and capable. He could interact with people. He did not seem like he was afraid of anyone except his mother and her boyfriend, whom I came to call the Monster Man. The police came a number of times to ask questions. There was one particular detective who I don't think bought the story at all. I think he thought that Buddy's mother's boyfriend broke his legs. And I can remember one time when they were questioning him, and again, this is the breakdown of protocol. You don't question a parent and her boyfriend in the patient's room. You take them somewhere else and you ask these questions privately. But they didn't. And I remember the boyfriend at one point standing up and saying, "You better leave us the hell alone, or you will not fucking like it." Now, I don't know about you, but that's almost a direct threat to a police officer. When he said it, the normal sound of the human voice really wasn't there at all. The harmonic, that painful, multi-tone harmonic, was stronger than I had ever heard it sound before. And the policeman flinched. He stepped back an entire step. And he had a look on his face of helplessness. The legal system was different then. It was far less common for a child to be removed from a home. It was very hard to bring charges against a parent. And plus, in this case, the only evidence they had was Buddy. Just the fact that he had bilateral broken femurs. And they had very little choice but to eventually accept the statement that he fell off of a 3.5 foot porch. Experience 4. Confrontation with the father. I never saw any affection from Buddy's mother toward Buddy. I never saw her give him a kiss. I never saw her stroke his hair. I never saw her sing the turtle song. And the boyfriend would simply stand next to the crib and glare at Buddy. Glare with utter, absolute hatred. Buddy, very interestingly, had developed kind of a defense mechanism where he could just turn his head toward the wall or toward the side where the boyfriend was not, and he could limit his field of vision. He'd sing his little songs. He had some little books. He'd pick those up. He went into his own world when the boyfriend was there. Buddy's father came one day when the mother and the boyfriend were there. Obviously, there had been some deeply painful falling out between Buddy's father and Buddy's mother. But it was very clear to me that Buddy's father loved Buddy and really wanted to be there. One day when he came, the boyfriend became livid, started hitting the wall, and said things that I can remember him saying very clearly. He said, "We could do what we wanted if it wasn't for you, you bastard." What did that mean? He told him one day, or the same day, "You're not going to ruin our plans." He never said what the plans were, but I believe I figured out those plans, and at the time I very much wished that I had not. I don't know why Buddy's father didn't fight for custody. This was Texas. A father getting custody over a mother was almost unheard of. But I sure wish he had. He at least seemed to have some love for Buddy. Experience 5. The knowing, the attack, and the shadow. In dealing with these patients and these families that were experiencing what I can only call welcome or perfect possession, there's always been a time when the primary possessee becomes aware that I'm aware that something is wrong. They seem actually amused by the fact that I can see that something isn't right. In the little bit of time I was out of Buddy's room, I would talk to the charge nurse. I would talk to other nurses, even other doctors on the floor. "Hey, do you notice something really, really strange with Buddy's room? Something really strange with that family?" And I would get answers like, "Oh, well, they're just a bunch of rednecks. Ain't no shortage of those. Do feel sad for Buddy, though." Nobody else seemed to understand. One day I went into Buddy's room, and the mother and the boyfriend were standing in the corner. They didn't say a word. I said hello. They didn't say a word back. They were glaring at me. The room, now this is where it starts to sound like silly TV tropes. The room was cold. The room wasn't just cold, it was an attacking cold. There was the sound of the harmonic everywhere. It horrified me. But as a nurse, you can't simply run away saying it feels bad in there. I looked over at Buddy's bed, and it appeared to me that light was being sucked away from that zone. It was as if something was absorbing all the light that should have been falling on Buddy. And one of the few times Buddy was sweating, he was breathing like he was hyperventilating, and he was crying, even though he was trying very, very hard not to cry. Buddy hated to cry. I think he had learned over the years that crying brings about bad consequences. I did not know anything to do to break through whatever was happening that day. I called it the attack. I went out of the room because it was close to mealtime and found the food cart. I got Buddy's tray and went back to the room, saying something, trying to be bright and airy, like, "Hey, Buddy, it's time for some food." Buddy hardly flinched. Anyway, I set up the tray. I was going to try to help Buddy eat, and the mother said, "Oh, don't you worry about that. We'll help him." Look, at the time in my life, I knew almost nothing about the paranormal, the supernatural. Even now, these stories sound like made-up bullshit. They sound like garbage, but they happened. And I've got to tell you, I was in that room, frightened for my life, my soul, certainly for Buddy's life, and feeling more helpless than I had ever felt before. What could I do? Could I call the police and say, "Hey, there's a mean sound and a shadow over Buddy's bed"? Yeah, that's going to go a long way. No, I was helpless. There was just nothing I could do except be kind and supportive to Buddy when I was there by his side. Experience 6. The crash. It was late one evening when the grandmother came to see Buddy. She had the things that she always carried. Little books, little toys, just little things that any 3-year-old boy would love to have. She was met at the door by the mother and the boyfriend, and within a few moments they were screaming at each other. The grandmother was screaming too. At some point, the mother and the boyfriend went back into the room and slammed the door. I called security. I mean, this is a hospital, and whatever else is happening there, we're not supposed to be having moment-to-moment violence. As the door was closed, the grandmother ran off of the floor. Strange to see a little woman like that run, but she ran to the elevator, got in, and left. A few minutes later, I could hear menacing speech coming from that room. I, like a coward, chose not to go in. Then I heard a crash. A big crash. The kind of crash you would hear if you took a big metal cart and turned it over on its side, on a hard tile floor. That made me go into Buddy's room. Buddy was screaming. I asked what happened. The mother looked at me and very coldly said, "Well, something seems to have slipped with his traction." She was not concerned about Buddy. I saw on the floor skid marks. I saw where the base support for the traction apparatus had slipped. The only thing I could think, and I did not witness this, but I believe it is what happened. I believe that the boyfriend, who was quite capable of doing so, picked up that bed from the bottom, held it up in the air, a foot, maybe 2, and then dropped it. That would have caused the ends of Buddy's broken femurs to bang against each other. Now, bone itself has no feeling of pain, but the lining, the surrounding of the bone, the periosteum, feels pain very, very intensely. And of course, Buddy would find that horribly frightening. I went and called security again and told them that something bad had happened. I didn't see it. Would they please just come there and be on the floor? And they did. I, at that point, was beginning to reach a point of mental damage for myself. And as far as I know, to this day, nobody else on that floor was aware of what was happening. Now, I guess you could make the argument that I was the only one there that was unrealistic. I was the only one that was paranoid. But I'm going to maintain that I saw something real. I'm not psychic. I don't have any powers, it seems, other than just the ability to detect this very insidious form of demonic possession. That's all I can do. My wife says that music is too happy for this episode. I disagree. To me, it sounds like a dark, evil carnival. The kind of thing like Something Wicked This Way Comes. Get on the merry-go-round, go counterclockwise, get younger 1 year every time the merry-go-round makes a circle. Go the other way, get older 1 year. You could either regain your life or lose every moment you have left to you. That's the feeling it gives me. So this is experience 7. I'll call this the disappearance. In those days, as I said, we worked 3 to 11 or 11 to 7, and oftentimes the hospital would be short-staffed in one area, and they would ask people to stay. Hey, Victor, can you double? Can you work 11 to 7? Down in pulmonary ICU or over on orthopedics? Generally, I could. I wasn't married, had no children. I needed the money. And so, yeah, I would often work these double shifts. I didn't do them well. I was very tired the next morning when I finished with them. But I did a lot of doubles. So, one Thursday evening of the second week that I had known Buddy, I accepted a double shift in pulmonary ICU. It was a busy night. I was dealing with a very, very sick patient. And the next morning, after giving a report, I thought I would drop by and just see how Buddy was, since he was most of my mental activity at the time. I got down to the end of the hallway, down to the Muppets that they had painted on the wall. Remember, this is a unit just carved out of an adult unit. And I poked my head into Buddy's room. And he was gone. There was no Buddy. There was no mother. There was no aunt. There was no grandmother. And there was no Monster Man. The entire room was empty. All of his things were gone. The traction device was still there on the bed. In the wall next to the bathroom, there was a huge hole, as if somebody had taken a large cowboy boot and just kicked a hole in the wall. I ran down to the nurse station. Hey, everybody, where's Buddy? I was at least hoping that I would get we transferred him to Texas Children's, or we sent him to another hospital, or something like that. But the answer I got was, Buddy? Buddy's in his room. I said, no, he's not. And I took several nurses down there. Buddy was gone. Somehow in the night, they had taken that child and moved him, while in Buck's traction, out of the hospital. I don't know if there were security cameras. There may have been. But there was no evidence as to where Buddy had gone. I looked all around the room, hoping there would be a note or something. We called security. They called police. The police tried to contact the mother at her last known address. We tried the phone numbers we had. We didn't get anything. It was as if Buddy disappeared off the face of the earth. I sat in that room after the police had left, after the hubbub had died down a little bit, and fortunately I wasn't involved In the aftermath, I didn't have to write any incident reports. I didn't have to do anything except wonder and feel sad. I had, a week earlier, come to believe that Buddy was destined to be a sacrifice of some kind. I know, as Malachi Martin said, that I saw the power of pain. So much pain, so much incredible pain had been visited upon Buddy. I saw the power of hating toward me, toward the father, toward the grandmother, and most importantly, toward Buddy. I didn't see the power of burning, but I had to wonder if that was what was coming. Because Buddy, this wonderful, innocent little boy, had been placed in what I came to call the Valley of Chaos. I wanted so much to be able to help him traverse that valley, but I couldn't. And he was gone. And where he exists in the world, or if he exists in the world now, I have no idea. Telling this story has been painful. The most painful podcast I've ever done. It has left me crying. It has left me with an upset stomach. It has left me not even worrying about little vocal errors I make, that kind of thing. You've heard the story of Buddy. I'm sorry I had to tell it in such detail, but that's the only way to tell the story of a child who is intended to be a sacrifice. You've been listening to the Trailer Trash Terrors podcast, Season 2, Episode 14. I got it wrong at the beginning. Paranormal Will was Episode 12 and Episode 13. Trailer Trash Terrors is written and produced by me, Vic Hermanson, along with help from my pal Boudreaux. All clips are used under the protection of the Fair Use Doctrine. The music you heard was provided by Lobo Loco and Smart Sound. Please contact us at trailertrashterrors@gmail.com. I'm sorry about the fact that there was zero joy in tonight's episode, but that's the way some stories are. Bye-bye.